Welcome everyone, and thank you for attending today's webcast, Vault Security Review. Our presenter today is Bon Rhee. He's a solutions engineer with Hagerman & Company. Also presenting is Forrest Judd. Excuse me, he's a solutions engineer with Hagerman & Company. Before we get started, I'll let you know that you're in listening only mode. If you have questions during the presentation, you can type those into the question panel that's located on the right-hand side of your screen. They'll be addressed at the end of the presentation. As we close down the session today, you'll be prompted to fill out a short survey. We do ask that you take a few moments to fill that out for us. Additionally, all registrants will receive a follow-up email containing a link for the recording of this presentation. With that, I'm going to hand things over to Bon.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. So thanks for the intro again, Ashley. My name is Bon Rhee, and as Ashley mentioned, also joining me today is Forrest Judd. We are both manufacturing solutions engineers here at Hagerman, and we support the sales team and our customers in pre-sales and post-sales solutions. So let's jump into it. So if you ever wanted to get better control of security in your vault, then today's webcast is probably for you, because the theme today for today's webcast is Vault Security. So I will be discussing front-end security, then Forrest's focus will be security on the back end. And I'd also like to add this functionality we are presenting today isn't available in Vault Basic. It is for Vault Workgroup and Vault Professional. So part one, I will be discussing lifecycle and object security along with the changes that have been implemented since 2017. I will then go into proper object visibility in the Vault Thin client, and finally, the new administrator roles. And for part two of the webcast, Forrest will discuss Vault infrastructure security and cover topics like service accounts, impersonation accounts, and SQL service accounts, and more. And to close out the session, we'll have our usual Q&A. So the security functionality in Vault Workgroup and Vault Professional for 2016 and earlier versions can be viewed as a two-gate model. The first gate is role-based permissions like document consumer, document editor, content center administrator, and so on. And the second gate is object-based security, or also known as folder security. And in the old model, if you implemented state-based security, the state-based security would always override object-based security. Now, since the 2017 release of Vault Workgroup and Vault Professional, you have three security gates. You still have the first gate of role-based permissions, but now the second gate is object-based security, and the third gate is your state-based security. So this table shows the resulting ACL, or also known as Access Control List, from 2016 and earlier versions of the Vault. In the old security model, when object-based security and state-based security are in effect, the resulting ACL is just equal to the state-based ACL. The second table shows 2017 to the present. And in 2017, the Vault team at Autodesk changed the security model. In this new model, the resulting ACL is a combination of the object-based security and state-based security. And if there's a deny in either the object ACL or the state-based ACL, the resulting ACL is a deny. Null is a soft deny, and it means basically not checking a box for the permission. This means that users must be allowed in both gates, the object ACL and the state ACL. In the next few slides, we're going to focus on the last two permissions of this table. If you have a subset group and a superset group with same permissions, the resulting ACL will be the subset group only with the common permissions. Hopefully this will become more clear in the next few slides. So let's look at the security model in a Venn diagram. In the new model, it's the intersection of users and permissions, or what is common between the object ACL and the state ACL that would have access. Meaning, users that are common to both the object ACL and state ACL, and the permissions that are common between the two. So in this example, only Engineer 2 and Engineer 3 would have RMD, or Read, Modify, Delete permissions. The first level of a security, or first gate in the vault, is the vault role, is the role the user is given by the administrator. In the global settings dialog, if you select roles, it will bring up this dialog, which lists all the possible roles in a vault. If you select a role, it will show all the permissions for that role. And here you can see the permissions for document consumer. So the user must have the correct role here, or they won't be able to access the object security or the state security. Let's look at another example, but this time inside the vault. We are logged in as username engineer, who is part of the engineers group, and the engineers group has a role of document editor level 2. The object ACL for the project scissors folder has the everyone group with read, modify, delete access. I have a lifecycle definition called engineering release, and in the for review state, the state ACL has an engineers group with read, modify, delete access. So in the for review state, the resulting ACL would be the engineers group only with the ability to read, modify, and delete, since they are a subset of the everyone group. The intersection of users between the superset of everyone and the subset of the engineers group is the engineers group only. And other groups or users wouldn't even see any files that are in the for review state. So here's a Venn diagram of the previous slide. You'll notice the everyone group at the object ACL and the engineers group at the state ACL have read, modify, delete permissions, but the resulting ACL, again, is engineers only with read, modify, delete permissions. And the important thing to note here is if you reverse the groups so that the engineers group was at the object ACL and the everyone group was at the state ACL, the resulting ACL would still be the same. So now let's look at another example. Once again, we are logged in as engineer. That is still part of the engineers group. The object ACL for the project scissors folder still has the everyone group with RMD access. We're still looking on our engineering release lifecycle definition, but this time in the for review state ACL, we have the engineers group with read access and a null or soft deny for modify and delete. So the resulting ACL would be the engineers group only with only read access, which the padlock indicates in the for review state. So the reason that only the engineers group would have read-only access in the for review state is because the common users or the subset of users between the object ACL and state ACL is the engineers group, and the common permissions between the two ACL is only read. And in other words, no one, not even the engineers group, would be allowed to check out these files in the for review state, and only the engineers would have read-only access to these files. Or unless you have a role that can access closed objects and their permissions, which we'll discuss later. Also part of the changes to the security model, a new additional option called definition security has been added. The first option is combine with object-based security, which is the security behavior we've been discussing for vaults from 2017 to the present, or the 3.8 model. And any migrated or legacy vaults will default to override object-based security. This means the security behavior from 2016 and earlier versions, or the 2.8 model, or where the state-based security becomes the effective security. You can change the definition security for your lifecycle definition, but you will get this dialog box and have to perform a reindex from the Vault server. Another change is on the Security tab of your lifecycle definition. An option called Security for Files Inside Folders has been added. If you click the Configure button, this dialog will pop up. And if you have implemented lifecycles for folders, and if you have state-based security, you can consider using this option. If you use a setting, you will have three options. The first option shown here is Apply Folder State Security to its files. This setting will propagate folders' state-based security to the files inside the folders. For this example, in the for review state, if you have a state ACL, it will be overridden by the folder state ACL. If you choose a second option, Apply Custom Security to Files inside the folder, whatever you have defined in this dialog box will be used to replace any state-based security on the object. If you choose a third option, Clear Security Override from Files inside the folder, when a folder reaches a lifecycle state, in this case for review, if there is an override on the file, the override will be removed from the file. Like state security, transition security works very much the same way. It has three gates. You need modify access at the object-based level and the transition security level. What is shown here is the permission transition for work in progress to for review. If you want security on your state transitions, the user must have modified permission at the object-based level and the transition security level to perform the transition. And in 2016 prior versions, you didn't need to define object-based level permissions. Up to now, we've been discussing security in Vault Explorer, or also known as a thick client. Now we're going to change our focus to the next topic, which is proper object visibility in the thin client. The thin client is mainly used by those who need read-only access, like non-CAD users. And it's called a thin client because it doesn't have all the functionality of the thick client and is accessed through a browser. In past versions, I believe prior to 2015, Chrome and Firefox were supported, but at this time, the only browser that is currently supported and has full functionality is Internet Explorer. And the thin client can be accessed by typing the server name / Autodesk TC in the address bar. At this time, the thin client is only available in Vault Professional. If you have Vault Workgroup, you can get a Vault Office license, which adds a thin client and gives you the ability to check in and check out Office files through the thin client. Again, having a proper role is the first gate in the thick or the thin client. And here's what the thin client would look like if you aren't given a proper role. You would only see the advanced find results, and which would basically be useless. Or in the thick client, you will see this error box. You do not have adequate permissions to perform this operation. But if you do have the proper role, here's what you will see in the thin client. You will see Project Explorer and Item Master along with the advanced find results. And if you have the administrator role, you will have access to some more settings, and these settings will take you to this window. And what I would like to focus on for the thin client are the file and item display settings for the thin client. So as you might have guessed, if the released file versions box is unchecked and not going back to our Project Scissors folder, the thin client will look like this. You'll notice we can see all lifecycle states, and it's basically the same view as the thick client. But if you do check the box, it will be like adding an additional gate. And you will only see those files that are currently released or have been released in the past. So the part numbers ending in 9, 10, 11, 12 are currently work in progress, but are visible because they have been released in the past. Part number ending in 19 is currently in the obsolete state, but was released in the past. And part number 21 is in a for review state, but was also released in the past. So if you only want to show what is currently released, you will have to add ACLs for these states. And if you do use the released file versions option without state ACLs, you should train your coworkers to use caution when viewing files, because some files may be work in progress or even obsolete. So not everyone will share my views, but my personal preference for viewing files in the thin client is to uncheck released file versions so the proper current state is shown. And visibility, again, will be similar to the thick client. And again, you should train your coworkers on lifecycle states and what each state actually means to your company. So if you've understood what I said about viewing released file versions in the thin client, the security functionality for items and viewing released items is going to be pretty much the same. For the latest version setting under history, as the name implies, if this option is checked, you can only see the latest version for items. So for my final topic, I'm going to discuss the new administrator roles for 2018. The 3 new administrator roles are Project Administrator, Security Administrator, and Configuration Administrator. You can have users with just one of these roles only, but in most cases, these roles will probably be used in combination with each other or with other roles. The project administrator role will probably be the most commonly granted to non-administrators because prior to 2018, the only role that allowed for unconditional deletes was the omnipotent role of administrator. And if you look at the project administrator's permissions, he can read and delete objects unconditionally. And this role is kind of ironic because, yes, you can delete anything you want, but if you look closely, this role cannot check anything out. So basically, we trust you to delete anything you want, but we don't trust you to edit files. So this role can check out files, but this role can undo checkouts for any user. And again, this role will typically be used in combination with another role like maybe document editor level 2. And in my opinion, I don't think you should give this role to a user who isn't using the Vault on a daily basis. It should be someone who understands which files, folders, and objects are important to their company. The Security Administrator role provides authorization for security settings for all object types. This includes files, folders, items, and custom objects. Users with this role also have the ability to see objects that are cloaked, so they can modify the permissions. So in prior versions, the only role that could access a cloaked object was the administrator and maybe Romulans or Klingons. And a cloaked object basically means a user doesn't have rights to the object, but it is still visible to them. Let me add, this role cannot change lifecycle ACLs, so you will probably want to add another role like Document Manager Level 2 or Configuration Administrator, so this user can test and change different lifecycle, different types of security in the Vault. In the previous slide, I mentioned Configuration Administrator, which is a 3rd new role added in 2018. This role provides authorization to configure Vault objects, management settings, files, and visualizations. You can view this role like it has administrator access to the behaviors, items, and change order tabs under your Vault settings. So Forrest and I were talking about this role, and it looks as if this role would be used when setting up the initial Vault for the first time. The initial configuration of a Vault when it is implemented. Because if you look at the permissions, most of these are up front during the testing period before it's even rolled out to the rest of the company. And this role will probably be the least used once the Vault has been implemented and tested. So I hope that was educational for some of you, and hope you guys learned a little something today on Vault front-end security, because now I am ready to turn it over to Forrest for part 2 of this webinar, Vault infrastructure security. You ready, Forrest?
I am ready. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you. I hope everyone else can.
Okay, great. And you can see the infrastructure security slide up on the screen, right?
I can, yes.
Okay. Well, thanks, Bon. That was a great review of what I call the front-end security for Vault, how people use it from day to day. What I'm going to move into now is more of the back-end stuff, things that normally get sorted out during the initial phases of an implementation, but there are some considerations for ongoing maintenance, especially if you use like domain accounts for some of these, some of these, I guess, infrastructure elements. And if you maybe show up for work one morning and your Vault just doesn't work. In cases like that, if your server is up and running, odds are something has gone wrong with security. So it's important to know, from an administrative standpoint, what elements are involved in the infrastructure, what accounts are important to the function of the Vault, and possibly how to troubleshoot when there are security issues. I do see a question came in from Rick asking about recording. Yeah, we packed a lot of information into the front end of this, and it's a pretty complex topic, so it'll be great to review this later on. The webcast is being recorded, and at the end of the session, you should get a link to the recording. It'll be available, I think, in a couple of days, but this is definitely being recorded, so you can review it later. I personally, every time I go to do something security related in the Vault, I have to think about it, even though I touch this stuff almost every day. I have to think about it and sometimes really review, what's going on with the security. So it'll be a great recording for everybody to access in the future. I'm going to start with a review of the infrastructure of Vault, all of the back-end components that are required for Vault to sort of do its thing. Then we'll get into a discussion of the various accounts required to make the Vault work. We'll dive a little bit into SQL Server security, mostly so that those of you that understand SQL Server and how it operates, I won't spend too long on it, only to show you that the accounts are there and to pretty much don't touch them. But we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the impersonation account, the purpose that it serves, its importance, a review of important folder locations on the Vault server and in your network. Vault accesses various locations depending on where your backup happens to be, where your file store happens to be. So it's important to know what those file locations are and what permissions are really required for those locations. And then we'll finish up with a discussion of scheduled tasks. I hope most people have some sort of regular backup of their Vault. I know in our implementations, we almost universally create a Windows scheduled task that runs a script that causes the Vault server to create a backup. Those tasks run under a certain user account, whatever you specify. So it's important to understand the implications of that account, what permission it needs to have, and the implications of configuring that incorrectly. So we'll talk about that as well. So just a review of the Vault architecture. There are, I guess, 3 if you want to really count the file system as as an inherent part of the architecture. We've got SQL Server database. we have web services, which are run by IIS, Internet Information Services, which is just a standard Windows component. And then we have file storage, where the files are actually stored on the server. And then, of course, we have our Vault clients. Now, in terms of the various accounts that are necessary to make all of these things function, there's a couple of services related to SQL Server. There's accounts within the SQL Server itself. For the web services, we have what's called the impersonation account, because the web services need to access assets on the server. They need a security context in which to do that. And so the way Autodesk has configured the Vault, they use a specified Windows account to make that happen, and we'll talk about that. The file store, essentially what comes into play there is making sure that the various accounts have the right permissions to those folders. And this is for if your Vault, all of your services are on the same server or same operating system. If you involve other computers in the environment, say for a remote file store or a remote backup, like backing up directly to a remote location, there are some considerations there as well. This is probably what trips people up the most from a security standpoint, is when you have a remote backup or a remote file store, trying to make sure that the various accounts that really need to have access to the server, where the web services are located, which is the heart of the ADMS, the Autodesk Data Management Server, the accounts that operate this guy also have appropriate permissions off that server onto wherever these files happen to be located. So the various accounts, I just want to kind of go through them one by one. The SQL Server service, and I'm going to bring a server up here for us to take a look at these and how you might review this information and change it. Right. So I have just a little VM here running Windows Server 2012 R2. And we can take a look at the SQL Server service. If you look at the services on your server, you'll see there are two SQL Server services: the actual database engine service and the SQL Server agent service. Right. The SQL Server service runs the database itself. So when the web services want to access the database and run a query, that service handles that request. The agent service performs two functions mostly in the Vault environment in most configurations. One, execution of SQL Server maintenance plans, things like updating statistics and checking database integrity. Those are typically, Autodesk recommends a set of SQL Server maintenance tasks, and that they be run on some regular basis, usually weekly is how I configure it. And the agent is responsible for executing those tasks when the time arrives. And in a replicated environment, if you're doing database or what we call workgroup replication, the SQL Server agent is responsible for running the merge processes that replicate the databases back and forth. So especially in an environment where you have workgroup replication, the SQL Server agent service is vital, and it has to be running, or you get no replication of database information, which is bad, to say the least. So it's important that those two services have the appropriate credentials to do their job. The impersonation account is what runs the application pools for the web services. We'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second. It also, accesses the file store. So when a user requests a file from Vault, the account that actually grabs that file from the location on disk, puts it into the pipe and sends it to the client, that's the impersonation account. So it has to have permission on the file store or it can't do its job. And there's another folder in there for ASP.NET, which we'll talk about too. And then finally, the scheduled tasks. Again, every scheduled task runs in the context of some user. Typically, you would schedule tasks like backup and defrag. In addition, there is a Vault account required to execute a backup or a defrag. And I've got a note down here about encrypting those scripts. So in my mind, if you're talking about potential security holes for Vault, the biggest hole in my mind is that for a backup script, any script that calls the ADMS console from the command line to like run a backup or a defrag requires an administrator account, and those credentials have to be stored in plain text in that script. That's currently something that is not encrypted. These days too, it's the only account that the Vault really requires for backend operation and maintenance. That's the only account that needs to have that where a password is visible in plain text. Some changes, I believe, in 2018 we'll talk about have encrypted a couple of the other service account or account passwords. But that backup script or defrag script is the biggest hole. Now, that script is usually stored on the server, so someone would have to get access to the server and the ability to read that file in order to get those Vault credentials. And so it's not really that big a hole, I would say. But it is something to be aware of. And I know tools do exist that essentially run scripts. So like it would be like an executable program that would in turn run a script that had been encrypted. That's a way to completely lock it down. I don't want to necessarily suggest any third-party tools like that because I've not been able to like verify their security. But I know tools like that exist. So that's just something to keep in mind. But again, someone would have to get on your server to use that. And in fact, I have been able to use this to get access for a customer for their server if they forget an administrator password. One of the most effective ways to get access to your Vault again is to go to that script. And if the backup has still been running, you'll be able to get into your Vault with admin access that way and then reset any passwords that you might need. Another side note about that, if you do get completely locked out of your Vault, if someone changes, say, the administrator password and you have no other administrator accounts configured, Autodesk support can provide a tool to reset that administrator password. It's something they don't just leave out floating around because then nobody's Vault is secure, but you can get essentially a time-limited utility from Autodesk to get back into your Vault if you need to. So when we're talking about these service accounts, the important considerations, one of the easiest way to ensure that everything functions properly, assuming that everything is on the same computer, is to create a domain account that is expressly used for these services and make sure that account has administrator rights on the Vault server. It doesn't have to be domain admin. You don't want to do that for sure. But give it administrator rights on the local computer, right? I know many of my customers just choose to use the same account for the SQL Server service, the SQL Server agent if they need it, and the impersonation account because it simplifies things, especially if you ever, need to manipulate, passwords or whatnot. You typically also want to make sure, unless your security policies just expressly forbid it, that the password for that account never expires. Because if the password expires, things like the SQL Server service won't be able to start, the web services won't be able to have proper access to what they need, and your Vault essentially is unusable until you resolve that situation. Right. So just again to review the SQL Server accounts and how you might go and adjust that information. On the Services tab, you'll see the SQL Server service, the SQL Server agent service, if you look at the properties of the service, the log on tab is where you would specify that information. You'll notice in my configuration right now, this is the default account when you install the Vault software from the default media, or if you install from SQL Server media and don't change it, the default account is a virtual Windows account called Network Service. You can always change that information here. So you could change this to, for example, Autodesk Vault. I should have a domain account set up with Autodesk Vault in there, but that's how you would do it. Put in your domain name, Autodesk Vault, and then the appropriate password. And then that information would be used the next time that the service is restarted. So, you would want to do this, outside normal working hours, but ultimately change that account, restart the service to make sure that it starts properly, and you're good to go. The same thing with the agent account. The impersonation account, that still needs to be a domain account. The way you manipulate that account, however, is via the ADMS console. So just to discuss a little bit more about what this account actually is, and how the web services work. If you look at IIS, at the application pools branch, anything that happens on the server on any computer has to run in a process, right? There's some process running on the computer that executes code. The web services are no different. How things are executed with the web services are in something called application pools. And with modern Vault, recent years, the default configuration is to have 2 different application pools. The DM pool is essentially database interaction. A user makes a request for what files are in a folder. The DM pool process executes, handles that request. Anytime file management is involved, if someone's checking a file in, getting a copy from the Vault, the file store pool is involved. And you'll see if you look at the running processes on the server, if you're curious about this, the W3WP or World Wide Web Worker processes are what these application pools use. And you'll see the username is essentially a virtual account managed by the impersonation account. These guys take on the credentials that the impersonation account would have. So you don't have to worry about any accounts like this. The account you do have to worry about, you can review in the ADMS console. In the administration dialog, under advanced settings, the first settings button right at the top is where you have your impersonation account, right? So by default, when you install the Vault, if you don't make any changes during installation, a user account named Autodesk Vault will be created on the local computer. That's one reason why you can't install or should not install the Vault server on a domain controller, is because the installer is going to want to make a local computer, local user account called Autodesk Vault. It creates that account during installation. It provides to it a default password, which can probably be found if you really dig through, especially some older Vault configuration files, but it's not published. And this is the account that is used to run the web services. And if everything is located on the same computer, that's usually enough, right? It's usually not that big a deal. But this account does need access to certain things on the server. It needs full control over any file store folders, right? So in most, production environments, when I'm configuring a Vault, I will have usually on a data drive, like an E drive or a D drive or something, a file store folder. You need to make sure that, that file store folder, that the impersonation account has full control over that folder, right? And you may need to add that, right? that account to this folder and make sure to give it full control. So that's probably the most important one. Well, I guess equally important would be this folder here, which most people don't know about. The reason I know about it is because of doing Vault support. And this can happen from time to time, even if you did the default installation and everything worked okay. What I have seen sometimes in the past is that somehow the impersonation account does not have appropriate permissions on this folder in the Windows folder. So Windows, Microsoft.NET, Framework 64. This is 64-bit web services these days with Vault are always 64-bit. The version of .NET, which these days is 4. This temporary ASP.NET files. So when the Vault is running, the underlying ASP.NET code is compiled and stored in these folders. You don't really have to worry about any of the contents. All you really need to know about is that for this folder, the temporary ASP.NET files folder, again, the user account, the impersonation account needs to have control over that folder. Otherwise, the Vault won't function properly. What's interesting is, you know, if it has read permission and not write permission, your Vault may work fine. But then, you know, let's say you like restart the server sometimes those files end up getting recompiled. If your impersonation account can't write to that folder, your Vault gets broken, right? So the impersonation account, the file store folder, and the temporary ASP.NET files folder are two places it must have control over for the Vault to work properly. And then from a backup perspective, the impersonation account writes the file store to the backup folder. So your backup folder must contain permissions for this impersonation account for it to write to it, which again, on the local computer, if your backup is local, which is recommended, and your impersonation account is a local administrator, which is recommended, it's usually not a problem. Where it becomes an issue is if you're backing up to a remote folder. Whatever account the impersonation account is assigned to has to have write permission to that remote folder. If you're using a local computer account as your impersonation account, you're going to have trouble writing to a shared network folder. So in that case, you really have to assign a domain account to your impersonation account and give that domain account the appropriate permissions on that backup folder. So, and that's I think the number one reason why remote Vault backups fail is because the impersonation account does not have the appropriate permissions. Along with that, when it comes to backups, the SQL Server service account is actually what writes the databases to the backup folder. So the ADMS console creates SQL Server backups. The SQL Server user account writes the databases to that folder. And so if your SQL Server service account doesn't have write permission to that folder, your backup's going to fail. And so that's why I think, you know, most of my customers that do any sort of remote backup or, you know, have off-server assets in any form, they use the same domain account for all of these things. That way they can simplify their management of permissions and passwords. And then finally, the scheduled tasks, like a scheduled task user, is typically going to need full control over the backup folder as well. I know my scheduled tasks, the script that I use, it only keeps one copy of the ADMS backup on the local server at a time. And so the first thing it does is delete the previous backup to make room for the new one. If the script user doesn't have access to the backup folder, your script's going to fail. So that's something to keep in mind. Just a real brief note about SQL Server security. The SA account is required during installation. Well, I say that technically you could use another account that has, you know, sysadmin permissions, but you have to make sure and specify that in the installer. But that typically is only required during installation. I use the word typically there because I have seen isolated incidents where if the SA account is not enabled, that backups can fail for whatever reason. I've not actually been able to isolate a cause, but in general, it's okay to even disable the SA account for SQL Server after installation, and Vault will continue to work just fine. That's because there are two SQL Server accounts. These are SQL Server only. They have nothing to do with your Windows permissions that are maintained by SQL Server to run Vault tasks. These do have default passwords. I don't know what they are. I used to know what they are. They've probably been changed, but these days, any place that password might be located, like in a config file or anything, it's encrypted. That started with 2018. So if for whatever reason you need to change these, if you have very strict security requirements and you need to make absolutely sure that none of your installed software uses any of the default passwords, you can change them, but you must change them these days from the ADMS console. Right, so you can do that again in the administration area. These two SQL Server user account passwords, this is where you could provide a new password. Do not change these from like the SQL Server Management Studio because the Vault will break. This will change them and everything will be fine. And there'll be the web, like web.config will get updated with the new password and you won't have to worry about it. And just a quick review of what those accounts actually can do on the SQL Server if you're curious. The Vault sys is what is used for most things. The server name specific account I think is really used mostly for replication duties. The Vault sys account has DB creator, setup admin, and public. And then on any given Vault database, it has DB owner. It's not like these accounts have sysadmin access, right? But you should never modify these permissions unless you've got explicit suggestions from really ultimately from Autodesk support. Even Hagerman support won't tell you to change these unless Autodesk support has said it's okay. All right, so I kind of discussed the impersonation account. I got a little bit ahead of myself. So let's just move on to these, important file folder locations. I've talked about a few of these already, but just to summarize, the program files folder, this is where ultimately things like the web service files are stored, web.config, which the IIS needs. Your impersonation account is going to need to have full control over that so that it can make changes to web.config, for example. Any file store folders, you're going to need to make sure they have access to. And like I said, the temporary ASP.NET files folder. And this is the same location on every Vault server. The file store folder is going to depend on your configuration. The default location is in the program data folder. It could be anywhere, right? But the file store folder, the default location for the file store folder, the ADMS console still writes log files to that location. So you're going to need to have write permission to that as well. The backup location, whatever location you back up to is going to need, you're going to need write permission to. And then if you're in a replicated environment, workgroup replication, I should say, that also requires a shared folder, and your impersonation account and your SQL Server service account and your SQL Server agent account, all of those will also need control over that shared folder for replication. And then finally, I want to kind of finish up with some considerations for scheduled tasks. Keeping the Vault running day to day is one thing, right? Normally, once you get that set up and functional, unless the accounts get disabled somehow or their passwords change, you don't have anything to worry about. Vault's going to function just fine. Part of a proper Vault environment from a data integrity standpoint is backup, right? And again, that's normally something that is scheduled. Most of our customers use the ADMS console backup utility that gets invoked from the command line, and to automate that process, it gets invoked from a scheduled task. These scheduled tasks require a Windows account to actually execute the task and a Vault account for the ADMS console to do its thing. The most common reason I've seen for backups to fail, the backup's been running fine for 3 months, and then day 91, the backup stopped working. And oftentimes people don't realize that it stopped working and it's not been going for months, which is a very bad thing. The number one reason I see why that has happened is because whatever user account was specified for the scheduled task, its password expired. If its password is expired, the task can't run, your backup doesn't run, and that's bad news, right? So if all of your assets are local, if your backup is local, if your file store is local, if everything is local, what I would recommend is that you do not store the password for the account that's executing the task. It'll still use that account's permissions, but it won't have to validate the password, and it should run whether or not the password is expired, I believe. If you don't want to do that, if you've got off-server resources, if you're backing up off the server, you'll need to store the password. It'll have to be a domain account, and you'll want to make sure that that password never expires. If that's just not possible in your security environment, make sure and set yourself a reminder to update that password manually. Otherwise, your backup's going to fail. Right, and just again, for remote backups, make sure that any service account, impersonation, SQL Server, has full control over that remote folder, or your backup's not going to work. I guess that would hold true if for whatever reason you needed to restore from a remote location. That's really not recommended, but the same idea would hold true because those accounts have to read that folder to take in the information. So, all right, well, that I think was a pretty deep dive into security. I hope everyone is still awake. I really appreciate you guys sticking it out. So if you want some more information, the Hagerman homepage, www.hagerman.com. If you're interested in any training on Vault, any of the Autodesk CAD products, we provide that as well. We have YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, of course, youtube.com/user/Hagerman Company, Hagerman Co. on Facebook, and @Hagerman_Co. at Twitter. So with that, we'll open the floor to questions. So any questions about any of the security stuff we've covered today?
See, we'll give everyone a few minutes here, a few seconds. I'm sure everyone understood that, so there probably aren't any questions first.
Yeah, assuming everyone's still awake. Security is not the most topic.
So I still don't see anything coming in. So maybe there aren't any. Maybe we explain everything perfectly. Oh, here's a question coming in now, Forrest.
Yeah, I think it's just more of a comment.
Oh, okay.
A lot of info, yes. We're sort of a fire hose, I think. But yeah, again, there will be a recording. You should get a link to that, so when it's available. It'll also be available if you don't get the link. Hagerman.com has, we have all of our prior webcasts. It's a fantastic resource, actually. I believe it's called Webcasts on Demand. So I think literally probably a couple years worth of webcasts here on lots of different topics for lots of different Autodesk software. Autodesk software are PDM products. So you'll be able to go here. If you don't have the link, you'll be able to go here sometime in the next couple of days, probably under the data management section, and find this security webcast and watch it on the spot. So I haven't seen any other questions come in, so I think Ashley will go ahead and wrap it up.
Oh, here's one now. So Mark Jennings is asking, can I get a default password for Autodesk Vault SQL user for 2015?
Okay. Yeah, if you're talking about the SA account, and this one is pretty well known, so I don't feel bad sharing it. The default SA account password for SQL Server for the last probably at least 7 or 8 years has been Autodesk Vault at 26200, capital A, capital V. So that is the default password for the SA account during installation. Now, what I've seen in many environments is that SA account actually gets disabled somehow. I don't know exactly how it happens. It's happened automatically. I've seen in more than one case. So even with this password, you may not be able to log in. Now, I know whenever I install SQL Server manually, I always make sure to add the local administrators group to the SQL Server administrators. And so you may also try to log in with Windows authentication while you're logged in as a local administrator. That might also get you into the SQL Server instance.
Okay, so hope that answered your question there, Mark. And if any other questions, if you guys have any other questions, please try to just type them in the question dialog there. So Mark has saying, I'm stuck trying to upgrade to 2017. So Mark, if you have support contract, the best thing to do is probably contact support or maybe your account manager, and we can maybe probably take that offline and try to get you going with that. What do you think, Far? Sound right about right?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so I guess we only have 2 minutes left. Anything else you want to add, Forrest, or should we just hand it over back to Ashley?
I don't think so. Yeah, I think we're ready to wrap up.
Okay, well, thank you for the presentation, guys. This will conclude our broadcast. If you think of additional questions, you can just reply to the confirmation or reminder email that you receive from GoToWebinar, and we can get those to Forrest or Bon or your account manager to get the questions answered. Once again, if you could take a few moments to fill out the short survey, we would appreciate it. It will just pop up as we close down today. And you will receive a recording tomorrow in your email. And thanks for attending the webcast, and have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Yep, bye-bye.